Good evening, everybody. I'm Taylor White, a second year in Anderson's fully employed MBA program, and it's my honor to introduce tonight's panel. As Professor Edwards alluded to, the Huawei story has all the makings of a thriller. As we speak, two great powers, the United States and China, are competing on the world stage through business, law, diplomacy, military might, and espionage. This story sheds light on how businesses might get squeezed between these giants in the years to come. As students of business law and policy, we're excited for such timely discussion to unpack the relevant issues so that we may better understand how to anticipate and deal with situations like these in the future as we take leadership roles in our respective fields. Now, I'd like to invite the panelists to take their seats. First, sorry about that. It's a false start.
We're all on the edge of our seats.
First, please welcome UCLA alumnus Craig Ehrlich. Craig is the chair of Anderson Center for Global Management, and he's the former chairman of the world's largest trade association for the mobile industry. Next, please welcome Gary Lincenberg. And next, please welcome Jason Linder. Gary and Jason are partners at their respective law firms and both have expertise in navigating the types of issues that we'll be discussing tonight. Last, please welcome our moderator, Professor Christine Rhow. Professor Rhow teaches a course in non-market risks at Anderson. She's a lawyer by training and a former commodities trader, and she was a government minister in Hong Kong. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Taylor. Sebastian, you shared the story with us, very recent story about Chile. I thought we could show you two photographs. You can see this was in February, and these photographs were taken at the World Mobile Congress, which is the largest gathering of mobile industry in the world. So the future of Huawei. Is it going to be like that? Or is it going to be like that? Anyway, actually, tonight's talk really isn't about Huawei as such. It isn't even about U.S. China conflict. It's really about, in the business world, the kind of risk that you're all going to be facing. And actually, it isn't for people just even in the commercial world. Even if you're in the nonprofit world, you are going to be impacted by forces beyond so many different things. And so tonight, we have a chance to speak to our panel, who will help us flush out what these issues are, how they can happen, what happens when something hits you, not quite your fault, something we call non-market risk, and what are you going to do about it? So, Craig, maybe I can start with you. I mean, you've spent many years as an investor, as somebody who's worked in the mobile and technology business for a very long time. The Huawei case is such an excellent case, I think, for our students and actually for business people, because it has so many facets. Knowing all the people that you know all the people who are in this business in China, in Europe, in America, and the rest of the world. What kind of concerns do you have about the Huawei case? What sort of problems are they bringing to the fore that makes a businessman, an investor concerned?
There is so much to talk about, so let me try and be concise. The industry, who I don't speak for anymore, has embraced Huawei over the last 15 to 20 years, as well as other vendors in China. Previously, we had been dominated by the European industrials, Nokia, Ericsson, Alcatel. And then China began to become a major player about 10 to 12 years ago. And it's clear that Huawei and ZTE, to a smaller extent, both Chinese companies, have had a tremendous impact on technology, on the mobile industry, bringing prices down and bringing great technology. Having said that, so have all the other vendors, whether they're here in America like Cisco, Apple, Intel, Qualcomm. So the ecosystem has become enhanced with the Chinese competition. Specifically, the recent controversy of Huawei has caused great headaches for people in the industry. And it's caused headaches because Huawei has become so successful in working with the mobile operators such that if you take them out of the equation, there's a strong belief that 5G would be delayed around the world. You could argue maybe that's not a big deal. That's a whole nother discussion. But it's clear that Huawei is so well entrenched in the industry. I think, as you know, we've talked about it's a great case study, Huawei, but it really is about any business that many of you have already entered or beginning to think about. It's not necessarily just about selling equipment. I was sitting in a meeting in an unnamed country with an unnamed company, and I was sitting with its chairman, who's a friend of mine, and I said to him, you know, this Huawei thing, at least it shouldn't affect this organization, right? And his answer was, sorry, it will have a major impact on us. And he began to explain why in a way that I had not anticipated, because the tentacles of our relationships with vendors and partners is so, it's like an octopus, it stretches out. So if I were looking to two of my lawyers here, very high-paid lawyers, so I better talk fast.
Appropriately and reasonably priced.
Yes, thank you.
A bargain compared to the trouble you can get into if you don't talk to us.
There you go. So Christine, if I may, I want to kind of ask them, pose this question. So I'm sitting in the meeting and the chairman says, no, this situation could have a big impact on us. Well, everybody sitting here are not Americans. You're American lawyers. So this is not just
So this is not in America,
This
right?
is not just a legal U.S. question, is it? And how would it affect, as a client, what should I be aware of?
So I think, can I take it first? Great. Hi, everybody. So I'm Jason. I'm a lawyer at a firm here in LA called Irell and Manella. So I think there's sort of two halves to your question as I think about it, as I think about advising people in Craig's situation or all of yours. One is to sensitize everyone in the room to the breadth of the reach of U.S. law enforcement and the increasingly robust relationships it has with its foreign counterparts and its ability to effectuate trouble for all of you in the room if it chooses to. And then the second is to have you all think sort of systematically about the relationships that you have with your vendors, with your partners, with your investors, and how those might come to be of interest to the U.S. government. So one way to think about the first question, which is sort of the breadth of U.S. interest, is to there are a number of statutes that are in the handout you all have. There's what's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Economic Espionage Act, and some others. Let's take the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, partly because it's the thing I know best. I prosecuted it for a number of years before helping companies on this side for a bargain price. So it's a good way because it is the thing that the U.S. government has done, has taken the most robust enforcement steps, most aggressive steps over the last, say, 10 years. You might think, so the law is real simple. Don't bribe. Don't bribe foreign officials to get business. Real simple. You might think that if you're a Chinese company or an Indian company doing business in Southeast Asia or in Europe, that it's not of interest to you. But the breadth of the U.S. interest is extreme. Covers U.S. companies, covers U.S. citizens wherever they are in the world. Could be a U.S. citizen working for a French company's Thai subsidiary, bribing somebody in New Zealand, and that's a U.S. case. Never touches the U.S. Any company traded on the U.S. stock exchange, either the NASDAQ, and Craig has run companies traded on the NASDAQ, or on the New York Stock Exchange, those are covered. Whether they are, I've prosecuted and represented Brazilian companies, Hong Kong companies, a variety of companies. They're all covered by the U.S. And if you're none of those, you're not a U.S. company, you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not U.S. publicly traded, but you're dumb enough, you're purely foreign, but you're dumb enough to have somebody come and take one act in furtherance of a corrupt scheme here in the U.S. You're bribing somebody in Argentina from your headquarters in the Republic of Guinea, and you have one meeting in Houston. All of your conduct is covered by the U.S. It takes very, very, very little to come under US scrutiny for both the FCPA and a wide range of other criminal and regulatory statutes that the US government enforces. And so as you think about proceeding in the world, no matter where you are, no matter who you're working with, one thing you're going to want to think about is the far reach, the long arm of US law. And we're going to talk today about a number of ways in which US law can cause you trouble. So that's the first thing. If you walk away with nothing else, no matter where you are, don't think you're safe from trouble from the US law enforcement. That's really the thing to take away. And Gary and my card. Those are really the things you should take away because we'll help you when you're in trouble. So that's the first sort of thing I would say. And the second is, even if you are a purely foreign company and you think you're free of any sort of trouble with the US government, your vendors, your JV partners, your investors, your agents, channel partners that you just sell stuff through, all of them can cause you trouble. All of them require attention. All of them require thoughtful due diligence, risk assessment, sort of I think what Christine called non-market risk. All of them can bring trouble to your door. A 3, 5, 8-year investigation, disruption of your business. Like the CFO of Huawei, people hauled off in handcuffs. Who would think in Canada you could get arrested? But there it is. So those are the sort of the things that I think we were going to want to discuss.
Jason, can I ask you a question? I mean, you know, the extent of the arm of the US government, as you described to us, is truly vast. But we tend to get an impression that Huawei is now kind of a political issue, and
yes.
therefore it's become so prominent. But in your experience, how many of these cases are there? Because there are obviously Americans and non-Americans doing all these activities that you talked about. I'm not saying everybody is corrupt, but they could, you know, there are activities going on elsewhere in the world. What is the level of prosecution?
So you can look at it in one of two ways, as a lot or a little. So there's almost no way to estimate the amount of corrupt activity in the world every year, but this organization called Transparency International estimates there's about $3 trillion of corrupt transactions, payments to government officials to get contracts, payments to get stuff into the country, whatever it is. And US law enforcement and all of their foreign counterparts capture a diminishingly small percentage of that, a couple hundred million, a billion, whatever it is a year, but not the 3 trillion. And so from one perspective, you can think of corruption as the cost of doing business in many parts of the developing world and your risk of being caught as low. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act specifically, there are at any time in the US 200 or 300 open cases. China is the area, that is the country that has the single most number of enforcement actions involving it. China's probably first, Russia's second, India's probably third, and Brazil's fourth. Those are countries where the US at least perceives a lot of corruption activity.
So China, Russia, India, and Brazil.
So yeah, so let's see, BRIC, yeah, the BRIC countries. I think those would be the 4. And so you can think that in the sort of countries where many of you here may think you have the best economic opportunities, those are the ones that are most likely to garner US law enforcement scrutiny. The other trend in the last 5 years is it's not just the US anymore. For a long time, the US was alone in the quixotic quest of trying to stop foreign corruption while other developed and developing countries turned a blind eye. Through operation of the OECD and other international fora, other countries are now stepping up to the plate, and the US is working very robustly and coordinating with them extensively. And a lot of the actions, a lot of the prosecutions and corporate resolutions that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years are the US working with the French, working with the Dutch, working with the Brazilians, working with everybody in the world except China and Russia. Those two don't play with the US, but everyone else does. And so it is no longer just a US issue. If you've done something wrong somewhere, you should expect that increasingly sophisticated law enforcement may come to find it.
Gary.
Let me add to it with respect to trade secret theft, which is one of the 2 Huawei cases. We have a law called the Economic Espionage Act. And it's a law that is not widely used in terms of the number of cases. And yet, although some would look at this and say, well, this is Trump, harumphing and using this as a political tool against China, the fact is that both political parties, and I think more importantly, Justice Department types in both political parties, both agree that prosecution of trade secret theft should increase, and that it's probably the most under-prosecuted area. And the reason, in part, is because it's a political win-win. If the view is that China is stealing all of our trade secrets, and our companies are crying wolf to the government, why aren't you helping us? That rings across the board. And yet, it's very difficult to make these cases because much of the evidence and many of the perpetrators are overseas, many of them in countries that don't have mutual legal assistance treaties. And so it's tough to make those cases. And following up on what Jason was saying about when you have to look at, in terms of the long arm of our jurisdiction, and you look at whether there's vendors or intermediaries, with a lot of the statutes, the Economic Espionage Act, as well as some of the export control statutes, they generally involve intermediaries. So as businessmen who sort of go out the world and don't want to really think about the legal end of things, you're looking to create things as opposed to the lawyers who look to destroy things.
Preserve.
It's very easy to get a false sense of security because, for example, if you work for an aerospace contractor and you're selling some advanced equipment, you have a joint venture agreement with a company in Denmark. And so you view your exports as going to Denmark, and it's much easier to get your licenses approved. And you don't necessarily want to and don't necessarily feel it's appropriate to interfere and say, well, who are you re-exporting these products to? Who are the end users? This very case was a monster case that I handled about 10 years ago, where an advanced product was making its way to Iran, one of the 5 OFAC completely restricted countries. And as well, there were products going to China which had dual-use capabilities for both commercial use as well as military use. And the US government wasn't going to walk away and say, well, okay, you were just exporting it to this guy in Denmark, so it's their problem. They want to send a message that US companies have the obligation to know where things are going. And one of the biggest developments in, Jason and I practice really what we call white-collar criminal work, business criminal work. One of the biggest developments over the last 25 years is across a number of statutes, is the government placing on business an affirmative obligation to know. So for example, in the money laundering context, it's not enough for a bank to say, well, this guy who came into my bank and deposited a lot of cash, I didn't know that he got that from drug dealing. There's a number of steps you have to take to know your customer. And it's the same in different ways in different arenas. So it's very easy to lapse into a false sense of security because you're not doing anything improper. In your mind, you don't know of anything improper that's going on. And really what you need to do is ask the next question, are there red flags out there? Or what is a prosecutor potentially interested in if we're dealing with somebody? And the last point I would make is that it's never going to be a defense that everybody does it. So what happens in our world, and we both started as federal prosecutors years ago, and we're on the other side of the coin representing business and businessmen, it's regularly the case that the next wave of prosecutions is something that somebody did all along. When options backdating came along in 2006, everybody was doing it. So they didn't want to stop and ask the question, well, is there something improper in the valuation? And it's never going to be a defense, and you're never going to know where the next wave is going to come from. And I think with, for example, the Huawei case is a perfect example, and these are very typical. Huawei had a partnership, a business agreement, a joint venture agreement with T-Mobile. And from that usually springs out a case where somebody's crossing the line. And particularly in the cases that are prosecuted in the United States, because they see activity in the United States, They have potential targets they can arrest in the United States, or people who may be traveling here that they can arrest. A lot of these things are not necessarily the conduct that you're involved with directly, but the intermediaries and what you might be deliberately ignoring, or red flags that are out there that you're not paying sufficient attention to.
Well, you will have an opportunity in the next few minutes to start asking what questions you may have. But before we open to questions, Craig, having heard from your two lawyers what you now know, what kind of concerns do you have? I mean, in terms of, am I my brother's keeper kind of thinking?
Well, I was reflecting on why I spent most of my adult life overseas and not practicing business here in the U.S. That's not said as a judgment of my great lawyers, but when you are overseas, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Philippines, India, all the places that I've been, a lot of what you gentlemen are telling me, I'm not thinking about. Now, as my lawyers, you probably are now thinking, but Craig, you should be thinking about this, and I respect that. But I'm thinking about all of you. I know there are many Anderson students who are from China, from India, from Brazil, Russia, wherever, or many of you are thinking about going international. And I think it is sobering to listen to the lawyers. On the other hand, as entrepreneurs, and many of you are in companies, but you probably have an entrepreneurial feel to you, it can feel overwhelming to listen to this, and makes it very hard for me to be as creative as I want to be if I'm having to always worry about my lawyers. Now, you must have clients who say the same thing. How do you deal with that? How do you make sure that we don't crush the entrepreneur, the U.S. government doesn't crush the entrepreneurial spirit of people who are, whether they're Americans or not, doesn't matter.
So, if I may, I'll go first on that. And I was thinking about almost exactly this question. So Craig and I talked a little bit before we started speaking up here, and maybe 10, 15 years ago, he listed a company on the U.S. Stock Exchange that was based in Hong Kong. And I, as a lawyer, and the kind of lawyer that I am, the first thing I said is, well, then you must have then had to be concerned about compliance with U.S. law. And he said, I was the CEO. I don't know, maybe somebody was. The lawyer should have been, but that wasn't me. And I think we want you all to be maximally creative, maximally aggressive, maximally invested in creating businesses and creating value and employing people. That's great. I think there are two things that you should be focused on that will keep you from having to hire us on the back end. One is culture, and the second is hiring. So your job as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, is not to be pedantic and worry about the things that Gary and I worry about. We're the dorks who studied on Friday nights while you guys were out making friends. And that's why we're up here as lawyers, and you guys are all going to go make businesses. That's fine. But you don't need to worry about it. You just need to create a culture wherever you are, whatever leadership role you have, where you lead by example and you hire people who want to do the right thing and who want to comply with the law. The rest of it follows from that. You set the tone. Be maximally creative, but within the bounds of the law. Don't cheat, don't steal, don't bribe. Don't let your people do it. Don't say, whatever the lawyers say, we need to make our numbers this quarter, so recognize revenue a little early, or go ahead and pay that payment to the government official asking for it, or whatever the shortcut is. You create culture by example, by leadership. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is hiring. You hire people in-house or outside lawyers and compliance professionals who are like us. You want people who are smart, who are pedantic, who are willing to ask hard questions, and who are willing to say no. Your job is to go out and be maximally creative, and there should be somebody like us who tells you when you've gone too far and helps you steer on the right side of the line. And when you have that, Obama had an 8-year presidency that was almost entirely scandal-free, and he credits it to listening to his lawyers. Contrast that with the current administration. You want to be like one of them, not like the other.
Gary, what have your clients in the past been asking you, or how have you tried to advise them?
Well, so first of all, my practice is not to advise people on a going-forward basis. If somebody comes to me and says, can I engage in this practice, they go to a different lawyer. I deal with usually after the problems come, and then they need to figure a way out of it. But what I would say, and as a follow-up to what Jason was saying, is that, and maybe this is a little more negative on the creativity, is that if you're in a situation where you're looking to not discuss something with the lawyer because you know they're just going to trip what you're doing, there's a question as to whether you should be talking to them. That should give you some pause. And a lot of the cases we do, I gave the example of, or the example you just gave with revenue recognition. I have a big revenue recognition fraud case in San Francisco right now. And where you tend to see these crimes occur, or alleged crimes, are where when a company goes from private to public, and the culture has to change, but the executives are used to doing something in a less transparent way, and all of a sudden they're feeling different pressures. They're feeling pressures to meet the numbers of the street and the analysts and so forth. And so you tend to bend. So I agree completely that the starting point is the culture that you set. But you can never use creativity as a justification for shortcutting.
Craig, you've taken companies public. You've always tried to hire the best people that you could. How do you see what your two lawyers have advised you to do?
Well, I very much agree with both of them on the first issue of culture. And I do think, as all of you are in companies or starting your own companies, I greatly respect this notion of culture. You have to decide how you're going to live your life. I'm pleased to say I've never sued anybody and I've never been sued. And I've walked away from some deals where I've lost money because I probably should have sued, but in the end, life seemed to be a lot better without worrying about lawsuits. Sorry for the lawyers not getting paid.
Oh.
But it just made sense. And I know all of you, and some of you may be these kind of people, some of my ex-partners in different deals, they're aggressive sons of bitches, and in their own partnerships or their own businesses, I watched them go after people, and I just thought to myself, that is not how I want to live my life. So I think you have to make that decision. You have to look in the mirror and decide, who am I as a person? And that should be representative of how you conduct yourself in your business. Now, I'm not naive. You can't always be the nicest person in the world in business. You've got to make tough decisions. You've got to hire the right lawyers. But the fact is, you've got to have the right kind of people around you. And I've been very fortunate to hire the right kind of people.
Well, I think this is a good moment to open up to the floor. I assume some of you are foreign nationals, and you might have a particular set of questions that are different from, let's say, an American. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Manuel. I'm MBA student from Moscow. So it's a question about Russia-US relationship, and somehow it's like China is over there. So in 2015, when one of the Russian bank was put in sanction list, Visa International immediately stopped to service their cards. So a lot of people having money in their bank could not use it. I understand, and everybody understands that it's Visa had to follow the rules, but it's also because of people were hurt. It also influence Visa reputation and Visa. My perspective of Visa. What is Visa? It's not just company free and in the market, but it's an American company which should follow American rules. Another example, Russia recently made a new law that if Russian company follow American sanctions, it is crime. So again, Russian company that has to follow American sanctions, could be sanctioned by Russia. So again, business over here or in Russia, they are kind of hostages in that political situation, the political environment. So I don't have question, actually.
Do you want to come sit up here? I mean,
those are excellent examples, because I think what you've said is sanctions sometimes is of an entire country, and sanctions sometimes is specific to certain people or an institution. Like I think your first example was a bank.
Yeah.
And that actually created a lot of people, I guess, who dealt with the bank.
Yeah. So now I trust MasterCard, not Visa.
Right. And then your second example, it's in a way even more frightening. You could be a national of one of the countries that are having a punch-up with each other, and you could be caught potentially by both. I wonder whether any of the panelists would like to make a comment or some observation.
Thank you.
I mean, the only thing I would say is I agree that it's a terrible situation when people are caught betwixt and between. And they're almost caught up in where there's competing laws, if you will, competing enforcement efforts. And I would just add to what you're saying that it gets much worse. The collateral consequences to businesses when they're either under investigation or persons under investigation are enormous, and many of them you don't see. Even if a person at the end of the day never gets charged, banks will cut off relationships with you, credit card companies cut off relationships with you, and we see that all the time, and it's become much more common because the large institutions are much less concerned about the unfairness to the little guy, if you will, or the individual case, and much more concerned with how they're going to be perceived by the government.
Yep. The only other thing I'll say, I think that's all exactly right, is we see this sort of pattern lots of times in lots of different industries. So another example is Swiss banking secrecy. So the Swiss banks are famous for wanting to be incredibly secretive and help you keep your money free of scrutiny. The governments feel differently often, and the US government felt very differently about US tax evasion starting 10, 12 years ago, and you end up with a fight between differing political regimes, differing sets of norms, and businesses caught in the middle have to give one way or the other. There can be some times when the problem is intractable and there's no way to thread the needle, and a company has to give up doing business in one country or the other. There are lots of other times, like with the Swiss banks, where their long-held, cherished norms of secrecy give way before, in this case, US law, legal requirements. And in every case, it's hard and it's painful and the transition is difficult. That is the unfortunate reality of the ways in which criminal law can come to effectuate sometimes competing political concerns.
Right.
Let me respond as a business person. I mean, and unfortunately, I'm going to be somewhat negative because of the circumstances of Russia. As an entrepreneur, and whenever I talk to groups like this, I do say to MBA students, look at the countries that you're keen on going into. It may be your home country, or it may be a neighboring country, or completely somewhere you speak a language. The rule of law is very important in business. And there's a lot of countries where the rule of law is not very strong. And I personally have stayed away from many of those countries. I've tried to go to countries that may have certain risks, certain political risks, but I tend to try and weigh the legal risks very seriously. And I would say, as you join companies, make investments, look for vendors, think about where they come from, think about their standing, and make sure that if you pick a partner, that you've picked the best possible partner and a partner who agrees with you about legal issues. And so you can eliminate a lot of problems by staying away from certain industries, certain partnerships, certain countries. It does narrow it a bit, but I think, again, depending on how you want to live your life, if you want to live it on the edge, go right ahead to some of these countries. But think very smartly about the risk-reward ratio, and that reward better be massive for some of the risk you may be taking.
Right, because Gary is really expensive, so.
Yes, and you'll see him, right?
Yes.
I have two questions. Given the far-reaching legal power the U.S. has, how is it possible that the US is accusing China of not following the WTO rules for the past 30 years, and yet it has not been able to do anything about it for the past 32 years. That's the first question. And the second question is the ongoing current US trade negotiation. Today, I think it was just saying that the enforcement is almost done, negotiation is almost done. I'd like to hear your perspective on how exactly enforceable whatever trade negotiation they will reach, given the far-reaching power of the US legal system. Should the Chinese government be worried about that? That the US can come into China to reinforce, all those laws?
So the second question is very interesting because we're hearing news coming out about the imminent agreement between US and China on settling their trade dispute. But one of the issues is about enforcement. And I think in the news just in the last couple of days, it's about mutual enforcement. So I'm just wondering on this point first, in these kinds of political trade agreements, the issue of enforcement, how might it work? Gary?
I'm not an expert on trade agreement enforcement.
Nor am I. Craig might have the most knowledge about this. It's a fascinating question for the next panel next week, but...
Well, I think it's an important question, but maybe it's quite a new question. I mean, I'm just wondering where, it's so high profile today, and both countries are saying to each other, how do we enforce? Now, we don't quite know exactly which are the bits they are going to insist on enforcing. We get the impression from the news that, so for example, if China says, well, within a certain time I'm going to revise my law, is that what they're looking for? Or is it something deeper, more than kind of a political promise? So we don't really know yet, and I think I'm sympathetic with our legal advisors that it may be hard to answer. Craig, do you have a view on this?
I probably don't have the kind of view you want to hear it, only because I'm also not an expert in this area. I do tend to think that the trade agreement that will come out will be short-lived, in my opinion, and I think it will be continuously modified once Mr. Trump is no longer in office.
Is anybody else in the room who might be more knowledgeable about this particular question?
Could I just ask
Yes.
a follow-up question, echoing what you said?
Yes.
I was wondering, could it possibly be the very concern that you had expressed, in the very fact that if I were the Chinese government, I would be very, very concerned about the far-reaching power of the US legal system, that if I reach any sort of agreement, I would have to agree for you to come in and enforce it, possibly within my own borders. Could that possibly the very cause for the trade negotiation to actually stall?
Well,
Because that's another question, that's
Right.
another possibility.
I think I would advise that we don't speculate on that question right now, because it's a very, very interesting one. Now, you did have a first question, which is about the WTO. I'm not sure that's a question that we can answer in terms of, again, how the US had not taken China's alleged non-compliance more seriously. I think that's your question. But we won't answer that if that's okay. But
Let me add one last thing
Yes,
about,
please.
I think the challenge for China is they're dealing with a government that's headed by a gentleman who has built his smallish empire on reneging, consistently reneging on business deals.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were the Chinese government, there's a pragmatic side, which the Chinese have consistently been quite pragmatic. I think they want to get something done. I think something will get done. But I think what's behind them is how is the current president what is he going to renege on first?
It's
a real challenge.
It's an interesting perspective. What you're really saying is, well, the Chinese government might not trust the US government in terms of its current leadership, whether it's going to stay with an agreement. There's a question on the other side. Yes, please.
Thank you all for coming to speak to us today. It's been very interesting. I want to ask a question that's a little more specifically about Huawei. If you were advising a multinational corporation today about their IT policy and more generally about their interaction with vendors and suppliers and things like that, would you recommend that they stay away from the use of Huawei or interaction with Huawei systems?
I would have to know a lot more about. I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends. So I would have to know a lot more about who the multinational was, how much interaction it had with the U.S. government, whether it was a defense contractor, whether it made cement. It would depend sort of what it is, what it does, where it's headquartered, where it's listed. I think there is a fair concern among the U.S. business community and legal community that Huawei is in some way closely affiliated with, controlled by, owned by the Chinese government. That's a pretty good reason to pick Cisco or Qualcomm or Juniper or anyone else. But it would depend, is the short answer.
I think one of the things I've been thinking about is Huawei must be the most checked out telecoms company in the world. If they've found anything, any of these issues about backdoor and so on, surely it would be out there.
And if you look at the language of the politicians here in the U.S. and the government, they've not proven, Christine, what you just said.
So it's not a technical issue.
But they say the potential risk.
Yeah.
Right.
I think you could use that term for almost anything, anytime, anywhere.
True.
And as a U.S. citizen, if they know something, please tell me. If you don't know something, stop talking about this. You need to prove it to me.
Okay,
and
Sebastian.
as having somebody run a mobile operation, I have to make $1 billion decision on whose equipment. And if you tell me they have a back door, they're not getting my deal. But if there's nothing you can show me, I'm going to be a bit cautious, but...
Sebastian, I think Sebastian is dying to say something.
Craig, come on. I don't know anything about Huawei except that the CFO is detained in Canada. Countries like Canada do not detain people without any suspicion or some evidence. So just knowing, you say they have nothing, they must have something.
But maybe we can ask the lawyers, right?
So I think
About
that
extradition.
But that's not why she's detained.
Hold on.
Yes.
She's detained for something that
But it's like Al Capone,
Iran and all
it's
that.
like Al Capone. Saying that there's nothing. I think that we should be a little more careful.
Well, but let's divide the two
Yeah.
issues. One is a particular case involving allegations of criminal wrongdoing. And let's just assume, we don't all know the evidence, we've seen the allegations, let's assume that there's probable cause to believe there's something there. Those cases will play their way out. There's a lot of companies that have individuals, and sometimes even the companies are charged. That doesn't mean they can't move on and do business. The previous question, which is sort of the $64,000 question, is there's a lot of uncertainty here. How does a company react to that? So let's say you're a German company.
But what about, Jason said cement. So let's assume it's cement, which is a Monterrey, Mexico company. But you've seen the big trucks with concrete here in LA, so they have offices in LA, Dallas, everywhere. So cement company from Mexico, and they're saying, should we go with Huawei or should we wait?
Well, so let me just, whether it's a Mexican example or a Brazilian or a German example, you say, all right, do we want to enter into an agreement? And you break it down. You say, all right, what is German law and what do we expect German law to become? And the German government, I think, has come out and said, we're going to go ahead and do business with Huawei. Second, you say, all right, but if the US has trade sanctions in place and criminal laws, second question is, what's that going to mean for the other parts of our business that are dealing with U.S. companies. And that creates an uncertainty, but there may be some laws in place where you can answer that question and say, if we continue to do business as we're doing it, we will be in violation of U.S. law. And so you then make a business decision, or you take it to the next level politically, and you go back to the German officials and say, you have to negotiate on a political level with the U.S. government so that we can have some greater certainty.
Gary, I think you've made such an important point here, because I think if it's a technical issue, right, whether they're eavesdropping or the back door, we now have a number of reports from governments around the world that they haven't found anything. Secondly, what you're really saying is, if then, let's say, the Germans and the Belgians, right, they've now come out to say that, that they're going to deal with Huawei, but the practical effect of a German company or a Belgian company, if they decide to go with Huawei, what you're really saying is, well, if they also have dealings with the US, they have other dealings, it could be actually quite difficult for them.
And this is an issue that we deal with regularly, and Iran is probably the best example, but there's a lot of examples where companies have to make decisions on what they're going to do. Huawei is really putting this on the front page because it's this massive company and a massive new industry in telecom, and it's going to have huge ramifications.
But Craig, this is what you were really talking about when you were talking to your friend who runs a major company. It's a non-American company, and this is exactly what he was concerned about.
Correct.
Can you say a little bit more about that? So I think it's important for, the audience to understand the fear, the concern that a company might have dealing with Huawei.
His concern is
and it's not technical.
His concern is that company has operations in different countries. And his point was to me, my naivete, was I just thought it was boxed in here. And he said, no, this could affect us in any one of these countries that we have an operation, that we have even a very small company in, including the US.
So is it viable that if you were the German government or the British government, and you see no reason to actually say that there's a problem with Huawei in terms of the back door, but actually, in reality, your domestic companies who are going to be rolling out 5G, then the decision is theirs, whether they're going to buy Huawei equipment.
Correct.
And what you're saying is, because of all these other potential problems that they might have with the US, that actually Huawei would still feel, it could still be a negative decision.
And you're making a point that was a little bit of the inspiration for having this meeting for all of you, is to understand these are not straightforward equations as a business person. It has become so complicated that, okay, there's no backdoor, there's no spying, but there's still other issues out there. And you as the decision maker or part of the team that's going to recommend to the boss or the CEO, you've got to now look at this in such a holistic way that, as experienced as I'd like to think I am, I wasn't in this small case, and I should have been. So I've become very sensitive. So I wanted you guys to hear about this stuff, because it's going to be on your plate at some point in your career.
And when you're looking at these issues, you can't analyze it with form over substance.
Right.
I think the Huawei case is an example of that, where it's not an example of the trade issues involving Huawei. It's some subsidiary or company that has interlocking ownership. It's never going to be a defense for you to analyze this and say, well, this company is not exactly that company, so we're okay. If there's a connection, the U.S. will exercise its, they're not going to use that ruse to stop them from exercising their long-arm jurisdiction.
Right. And then tying in one of Craig's earlier points, for trade and export controls and sanctions, those are areas where the president and his team have a great deal of unilateral discretion and authority to make changes like that overnight. Trump often sleeps poorly, wakes up, watches Fox News and changes his mind. And that could easily happen after you've invested $1 billion in Huawei infrastructure in a way that's very detrimental to you. And so, for business people who want predictability and don't want to create issues, there is not a less predictable human being on the face of the earth over the age of 3 than the person currently in the White House.
Yes.
I guess my question is a lot of the conversation you guys are having is that you're making or a business is making a decision between going with a Huawei product or maybe not going at all with the product. I guess could you talk a little bit about why the conversation right now is Huawei or not Huawei? I guess what I'm saying is why is there a big lag between Huawei, which is a Chinese company, and any company that's in the West? We'd mentioned Finnish companies, we've mentioned companies here in the US. Why is there this big difference, right? Because it seems that the main problem is that Huawei is a tech company going into the West, and the West has no competitor, I guess.
No, they have competitors.
But not for 5G, correct?
Well,
No, Qualcomm, but
let me comment a little bit about that. I think I got into that in the very beginning. Industry was dominated by some European companies. There hasn't been, very romantic.
so Gary, there's something
There
I wanted to
hasn't
tell you.
been American companies who've actually been in the exact space of Huawei. There's part of the product line of Huawei that might imitate the product line of parts of Cisco, Intel, Qualcomm, other companies, Juniper, a lot of these companies. But America did not build a company similar to Huawei. Huawei went in and decided to just do everything. So I think that's one of the problems. And the truth of the matter is, Huawei is as advanced as any vendor in this area. I'm not going to say they're better, because that's so subjective, and I'm not an engineer. They used to work for me. I'd hear the arguments about this product, but clearly they're in the top 1 or 2 in the world for the next phase of the mobile industry. But let's remember, Huawei's in many industries. They're not just in making mobile equipment. So that's, I think, the big focus. Now, if you're cynical and you want to follow the president's line of thinking, make America great again, the problem is America doesn't have a company that directly competes with Huawei. We have many companies that compete with parts of Huawei. And to my knowledge, they do quite well in the world. But Huawei has $105 billion in revenue in 2018. There aren't a lot of companies, manufacturing companies, that produce that.
Yes. Please.
Question, I have a mic already.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Prateek. Thank Professor Rhow for organizing this. It's always good to hear you, Craig. I have 3 questions.
Okay. Could you take them one at a time?
Short and fast.
Yes.
First is to Jason, because I don't know when I'll get his services for free again.
Say it again.
When would I ever get your services for free again?
For free again, never. This is a good business person right here. That's right. Yeah, now's your chance. Oh, look at that, the hour's up.
Something I've been thinking about the Huawei case for quite some time is it's not what the American government did, but the way they did it is, think about Mark Zuckerberg changing his flights in India and Indian government just detaining him randomly because of some charges which haven't been proved yet. So even if the CFO is guilty of something, even if there are some legitimate charges against her, the way in this entire thing was done, that doesn't seem right to me. But can you think of other ways how this could have been more fair? This could have been done in a more fair and equitable manner.
What do you think was unfair about the way that the charges were brought and the way the arrest
Just the detention itself. Again, I don't know law as well as you do, but just I'm thinking about if a similarly influential U.S. business leader was detained in any other part of the world, it would have been a huge news.
So I agree with that, and I'll say 2 things about, 1, why it happened that way, and 2, the fair inferences to be drawn from it. And I'm going to disagree gently with something that was said earlier. So I think the way that it happened is the way it probably had to happen. China So Gary mentioned something called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. That is an agreement between one country and another country that they'll extradite people, that they'll help enforce laws, they'll share information. China and the US have none of that. They are strangers to each other in the law enforcement world. And so if the US government wants to arrest somebody who is a Chinese national living in China who they think has violated US law, they very commonly have to do it the way they did it here, which is they issue through Interpol a red notice, which is a request for cooperating countries anywhere in the world, if that person comes to that country, to arrest them on the US charges and extradite them to the US to face charges. So the way that it happened, you file the indictment under seal. I did it a lot when I was at DOJ. You file the indictment under seal, you send out a notice to cooperating countries. If Gary shows up in your country, please arrest him for me. So I think the way that it went down, the game of gotcha, that's the way it has to be when countries don't cooperate. But in terms of the inferences to be drawn from it, I don't think that because Canada arrested her on US charges that means anything. What it means is Canada and the US have a treaty. Canada participates in Interpol, and they honored their agreement. They're going to arrest the person, let there be a probable cause or an extradition hearing. The chips will fall where they may, and they may send them to the US, they may not. But I don't think it's fair at this really preliminary stage to draw any inference about what she may or may not have done and whether it complied with US law based on just the arrest. And it certainly has nothing to do with Canadian law, as far as we know.
And don't forget, Canada has, I think, 3 citizens who've been arrested within a month of her.
In China?
In China, it's an interesting set of cases.
Yeah, so Craig mentioned the rule of law, and some folks in this room may disagree. China isn't, whatever its many benefits and gifts are, rule of law is not one of them. They torture, there's a reason there's not a relationship between law enforcement in the US and China. I was asked a number of times while I was at DOJ to share information with Chinese law enforcement officials, and we didn't do it because they wouldn't necessarily, honor due process, human rights, whatever. So,
and interesting, the last Interpol chief came from China, but then they pulled him back 6 months ago, and he's now indicted.
Actually,
in jail.
are there any area of law where the U.S. and China have any cooperation?
Not a lot. So, obviously, if 2 countries are both members of a trade pact and they submit themselves to that jurisdiction, they do. About 4 years ago, about 8 years ago, I was the chairman of the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice White Collar Group. And I said, let's do the first conference ever in China. It took about 4 years to get it together. We had to go through a lot of censorship steps. And we had the conference, and it was an interesting conference. But there's very little formal relationship. Now, I can go there as a lawyer. I can meet with people who may be witnesses. I can review documents. Arguably, I can bring back documents. But I'll also say that I'm very careful when I go there. There's examples of private investigators who went just to interview people who were arrested for doing private investigative work, like interviewing people, sentenced to 18 months in prison. You have to be very careful about, what data you bring into China, what data you take out of China. So I think the answer is very limited, and you have to be very careful.
Right.
And that's for a private defense lawyer. The US government authorities, nothing. There's no going to China to interview anybody. There's no getting documents out. There's nothing.
Right. I think I completely see where the examples that you have come across. The example that I've come across is in wildlife crime. What I'm saying is there are areas of law that may be regarded as less politically sensitive, where the U.S. and China are prepared to see if they could cooperate. And the one that I had been somewhat involved in was during the Obama administration. There was an interest to stop ivory, which, the import and export, the trading of ivory is unlawful. And the US and China had both political and, I think, enforcement dialogue.
But sure, there's dialogue, there's an attempts to have a mutual interest. but there's not something where if the U.S. says, hey, there's this guy who smuggled ivory into China, we'd like to prosecute him in the United States, there's no mechanism. Chinese government could say, sure, we're happy to voluntarily do that.
They do return extradition. Right?
No.
Between the China and the U.S.? No.
None at all?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there may be an example I'm unaware of, but no.
Okay, any other question? I think there was a question.
I believe actually the guy with the
Sorry.
mic still had 2 more questions,
Oh,
but
well,
I don't want to.
You have one more question,
One more.
right? Yes, the first one was free advice. And you said no.
The second question is kind of like a glimpse into the future. So like what happens now, let's say in a situation where the charges do get proved, and let's say the espionage charges get proved. So what can the US do in such a scenario, and would the US do? And on the other hand, like if let's say none of the charges are proved and she's proved to be innocent, then what can she do?
So
to a country like the US?
I'll take a stab at that.
Okay.
So first, view it as a traditional criminal case, except first, you have to have extradition. And I will say, extraditing somebody from China is a long and lengthy process.
Canada.
From Canada, is a long and lengthy process. Tons of areas for appeal and so forth and so on. It could go on for a long time. But let's say the person's here, and I'll give you a parallel case I represented a few years ago. There was a Chinese agricultural company, and there were Economic Espionage Act charges brought in Des Moines, Iowa, for theft of inbred corn seed. I represented one of the 2 executives. So my client came to the U.S. voluntarily, not thinking she'd be arrested, and she was arrested. They put her 2 little kids on the plane back home to China, and they put her in cuffs. We had a bail hearing in Los Angeles. Surprisingly, we actually got her released with an ankle bracelet, GPS monitored, but at least she was at liberty, which for somebody here from China who everybody's, in a case like this, the government's saying they're a flight risk, they should be detained, it's probably more unusual that you'll get that to happen. And in that case, she had all the due process rights. I got the case dismissed against her based upon arguments that there was an illegal search and seizure and an illegal interrogation of her. And when we won those motions, the evidence was too weak to proceed, and the judge dismissed it. Her brother was not dismissed on the same issues, so he went through the court proceedings, ended up pleading guilty, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. When he completes his sentence, he'll be free to go where he wants to go. But it will just proceed like any other criminal case here.
And you asked the question of if she's acquitted, what's her recourse against the U.S. government? The short answer is none. You can beat the charges, but there's often no way to get compensated for the misery and the disruption to your life of having been charged.
But I was sitting with a friend of mine from Huawei, who's very senior, in Spain 2 months ago, and he said, Craig, what do you think if Huawei sued the U.S. government? And I looked at him and I said, I think if you win, you lose, and if you lose, you lose. So my advice, don't do it. And did he take my advice?
No, he didn't.
No, the week after, they sued the U.S. government. So it convinced me I have zero influence at Huawei.
Or your friend was not as influential as you thought.
Yeah.
No, he made the decision.
There was a question. There was another question. Yes, please.
Thank you for being here today with us. So Germany is right now in the midst of auctioning their spectrum licenses, and they've explicitly said they would not be banning Huawei.
Yes.
And I guess the US government initially had some reservations, but they eventually relented. So how do you think that affects the narrative against Huawei going forward?
Well, I think, again, the US and the Europeans have different parts of the technology product line. And I think you'll find most of the European countries that are allies of the US have made a compromise. Yes, you can use Huawei, but the operators will probably not use them for what's called the core. And the core supposedly is the one that's most at risk. So Huawei will still get lots of business, but some of that will now go to Intel and Cisco and companies I don't even know about. So it's a little bit of a mix.
Yes.
So I came from semiconductor industry. So I have two questions. One is, given today's solutions, mostly intertwined dependencies, cross-licensing IPs, and all the dependencies around. For finished and unfinished products, how do you think the legal system would evolve in the future to be able to, given the current scenario about like the more conflicts coming in and more scrutiny based on like the companies itself to know more about how the ecosystem would go for and use cases at the end and all that. And the second question I have is, under this scenario, do you think it increases the complexity of how a company would strategize about like selecting suppliers or maybe multiple vendors like what Apple is doing?
Well, I'm not a legal person on the first question, but from a business standpoint and a public policy standpoint, I think one of the things, well, I don't really know what's in the minds of Mr. Trump and his group, but all of this attention has made one thing very clear to the Chinese government. We must control our own destiny. And so whatever trade pact is signed now, they'll adhere to in general. But what will happen is the Chinese industries will now fast track all the chipsets that they've been buying from Qualcomm and all the vendors in the US, and they will then have built, the US will, in my estimation, have encouraged in a positive way the Chinese to come back 10 years from now and compete with the US. Now, I'm a believer that it's okay for competition. I think it's what makes innovation in America fantastic. So I don't want to sound like I'm an apologist for the US, I'm not. But I think that was not thought out, and I think in the medium to long term, the Chinese will be stronger than ever because they'll control the entire chain of their components.
Well, actually, maybe you have a view, since
Yeah,
you come from the
you're from the industry.
semiconductor sector. Do you have a view on this?
I actually don't. I think it's a very complicated problem, which is why I asked. I do come from the companies that we had partnership with ZTE before, and it was like stopping because of the legal actions that was done, and then it resumed later on, and then stop again, and then resume again. So it just creates a lot of ripples in terms of how not even big corporation, but the question about now how the technology startup should strategize and what it should do in order to be able to befriend such risk in the future.
Well, it's incredibly difficult, and I think Christine teaches this in her class, but when you have a party in power or a group of people in power who are so transactional, Mr. Trump built his empire on everything's a transaction, and the ZTE deal was exactly that. I mean, one moment he's smashing them to pieces and they're literally going to go out of business, and President Xi calls him up, they have a private conversation, and Trump literally says, okay, let them live. I mean, now you go to your level, you're supplying things to ZTE. So what it goes to is
non-market risk.
Non-market risk. These are the things that you as business people are going to have to, you can't tell the future, but you're going to have to sit around the table with your colleagues and go through all the what if, what if, what if. Then you make the best decision you can.
I think one of the things that, at least in our course here at Anderson, we try to talk about is, as you become more senior in your company or your industry, you start having to think about these kinds of questions. Because when you are when you're early in your career, you're dealing with the technical issue, you're dealing with the issue at hand. But once you become more senior, you have to look at your industry, you have to look at other players, and wow, you have to look at not just local politics, you have to look at geopolitics. And these things seem to be happening very quickly. And I think the times that we're living in is we are seeing major shifts in technology and politics and economics in the world. And these things are playing into decisions that are made by many, many others in the world that has a direct daily impact on whatever your business might be. Now, these are not easy issues, and there's no single right or wrong answer. How can you anticipate, for example, what a particular government might do tomorrow? It is hard, but it does require, I think, senior management to develop some kind of understanding, some kind of competence in how, at the senior level of your companies, you're going to deal with these issues, both at a local level, because there is local politics, there's national politics, and then in global business, in global supply chains, there are all these other issues that could impact you without you dealing with it. So I think one of the other things that we discussed in our class is sometimes things happen. You didn't anticipate it. But then do you have the right people who are going to think through, well, what do you do next? How do you minimize the problems that you've not anticipated, but you need to act?
The bottom line is take Professor Lowe's class next year.
Anyway, any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi. Thank you for coming. So Huawei is one of a small handful of very successful global Chinese technology companies. And as we've talked about, there's no proof that they've done anything wrong, but still look at all this resistance they're facing. So I'm wondering what you think the broader lessons that the Chinese business and technology community are taking from this very painful experience.
That's a Craig question.
Wow. Your last couple of words were right on target. It's very painful for them. And I think they have pulled back a great deal. The question will be, will it affect their future profits and losses? Maybe some. I mean, everyone's different. But some of the Chinese companies are so integrated now globally that you don't even know that this is a Chinese company. Now, you guys are probably much smarter than me, and I only realized this a month or so ago. Those of you, do any of you use TikTok? Okay. Well, the Chinese, ethnic Chinese, yes. It's number one, you know, my daughter uses it, who's 14. Everybody in India uses it now. It's a Chinese company. It's owned by a Chinese company. And I think it's the third biggest app used here in the United States. So and I think it's owned by Tencent. Is that right? Is it Tencent? Baidu. Sorry. ByteDance. Thank you. Sorry about that. I got the wrong company. But these companies are so integrated now, we don't even know where these products are coming from. So I think in some ways that insulates them.
So I'm going to just throw in, even though I'm not a businessman, I'm going to make a prediction out of nowhere. So I think that a lot of the law enforcement issues that we have going on with Huawei, with the two indictments, and some of these other issues on Huawei's involvement in 5G in the world are going to be wrapped up into a trade agreement. Trump is a transactional guy.
Yeah.
He wants to get a trade agreement. He's going to just view this not in terms of, well, we can't let somebody who's stealing trade secrets or violating trade sanctions go. That's not him.
I agree.
This is a point of leverage. We're going to use it as part of the negotiation. Happy to give it up if I can go home and say this is better for the U.S. economy.
I agree.
Do you think this is part of the current trade negotiation or the next one?
This one.
This one.
I agree with what Gary said, and I think it's a sad commentary on the U.S. government.
Yeah.
One of the hallmarks of the rule of law is the separation between political and economic aims and enforcement of the criminal law. And it was a privilege to serve at the Department of Justice when that division was honored. I find what Gary said to be likely true and wildly disheartening.
Was there a question over there? Yes.
Hello, my name is Pradnya, and I'm one of the MBA students here. And I wanted to get back to talking a little bit about culture and corporate culture. So just last week, we had a panel that was talking about social impact and companies that felt that there weren't enough laws and there weren't enough rules imposed on companies to provide better environmental reasons, socially aware products, corporate responsibility. And then we're talking now about a company that's being accused of, I guess, some level of espionage and spies. And this question is open to anyone, including the professors. Do you see maybe more of a greater divergence happening in the future as business people, where you're going to have a group of individuals who are going to be focused on some level of, excuse me, corporate governance or pushing the envelope for social impact, and another group that's going to be pushed into, well, we need to be the fastest technology and the broadest scale and most vertically integrated, and they're getting further and further apart? I'm just curious if you see that, because literally just on that same stage we were talking about we're not doing enough to enforce more laws that should be in place.
Two quick comments. One is I sit on the board of one of the largest companies in India, and if any of you are from India, you know that the government now mandates that, I think it's 2%, I can't remember, of our revenues,
of revenue.
Have to be provided to socially responsible, charitable. So we have, and even before that, the Bharti Foundation has been building schools throughout India for 20 years. But this was mandated, so I think there's a real change coming in India. The second comment was, I don't know if this addresses it exactly, but I'm affiliated with another leadership foundation, and many of the fellows who graduate from it, they go into public affairs positions. And what I found interesting 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the tech industry, if you go to any tech company, you'll know that they couldn't care less about regulation, public policy, politics, because they say, I'm inventing the greatest, newest, fastest, smallest, whatever. And I said to my leadership foundation, our people ought to be in all of these companies in the next 10 years. So fast forward 5 years, if you look at the largest group of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and the European Union, who is it? It's Google. You know, before, and all the other companies now have massive regulatory groups. So I think there is a recognition, certainly in the tech industry, that understanding public policy, again, Christine's class, but understanding all these political issues, socially responsible issues, is both necessary and it's the right thing to do.
Right, and Facebook is an example of what happens when you recognize it too late.
Correct. Exactly.
Any other comments? Because this is a time to end, and that's a terrific question. One more question? Let's take the last question.
We're waiting for faculty here to speak up.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes.
Last week, Congressman Jerry Nadler, who now chairs the House Judiciary Committee, was on campus talking, of course, about impeachment, but he was also talking about antitrust enforcement, which he expects to resurrect, given perhaps a new Congress in 2020. So my first question would be about whether or not you think antitrust would be a factor in Huawei's calculation, given their vertical integration. It has been used before, AT&T in particular, and if that's a factor in any of your calculations on how to think about Huawei and how their calculus would work.
Antitrust, Huawei?
It's dead now. It will be dead until 2020, but...
Well, you need in 2020, you need a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. Would we be so lucky?
Well, we could be so lucky, but at some point, there hasn't been significant antitrust legislation passed in the U.S. for about 40 years now, and technology's changed, so...
May I suggest there's such fertile ground here in the United States with Google and Apple and some of these other high-tech companies that if I were on the board of Huawei or CEO of Huawei, I would keep an eye on what's going on, but I wouldn't be worrying about it. Because I think if this happens, you know, the politics change, I think there's a lot of companies that'll be in front of me that the U.S. government will go after.
And the only comment I would say is while antitrust enforcement is down in the United States, it's not down in Europe. And I would think that this would be an issue that they would really have their eye on.
Yeah.
Europeans have kept it.
That's right. They have a strong antitrust competition commission.
Yep.
Well, this is a great place to end tonight. Can you thank me?